Excellent. We are live on YouTube. So thanks for coming back to Wednesday Night Bible Study. We are continuing our study of the life and teachings of Jesus. And we are in the middle of the Gospel of Mark. We have been walking through a little more deliberately, a little slower. Interesting because we're currently in the lectionary year of Mark. So a lot of the stories that we're looking at, there have been sermons on at some point this year. I'm not going to spend too much time on those. You should have been paying attention to the sermons. That's all I know to tell you. You can, if you have questions about those, we can go back, but hopefully I can fill it in as we go along. But any questions or comments before we get going? Anything we need to deal with? As always, you can drop questions if you're streaming at home in the chat. We've got folks monitoring that. And ready to go? Okay, that's what we'll do. Let's look at Mark 6. This is a fun passage, mainly for some of the heartburn it can cause people. This is a fun passage. Jesus left that place and came to his hometown. His disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue. Many who heard him were surprised. Where did this man get all this? What's this wisdom he's been given? What about the powerful acts accomplished through him? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't he Mary's son, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? They were repulsed by him and fell into sin. So his hometown was repulsed by him being there. Jesus said to them, prophets are honored everywhere except in their own hometowns, among their relatives, and in their own households. He was unable to do any miracles there except that he placed his hands on a few sick people and healed them. He was appalled by their disbelief. Some other shade of meaning in that, shocked is possible, but appalled is probably not a bad translation there. So,
does that mean his sisters fell into sin?
No, yes, this is one problem we do run into when translating languages. We can run into some antecedent troubles. No, aren't his sisters here with us? They were repulsed by him and fell into sin. I think the they there is all of the people who are saying these things. I don't think the they there are his sisters who have fallen. I don't think the most recent noun is necessarily the antecedent. Though the modifier is dangling, I'm willing to give his sisters the benefit of the doubt and believe the real problem are the people who are asking these questions. Yes, that's an excellent point. This happens a lot in Hebrew, and sometimes you don't even have a good antecedent. It's just, and he said to him that he shouldn't do this to him. It's like, well, who's the he and who's the him? That happens a lot. The translators try to use their best judgment. Some helpful translators will tell you what they're saying and what they believe is happening, and other less helpful translators will just give you the antecedents and let you sort it out and figure out the best way to do it. So, yeah. One of the things that's interesting, Jesus' rejection by his hometown is told in all three synoptics. That is a Matthew story, a Mark story, and a Luke story. But Mark is the only one who uses this really strong language where it says he was unable to do any miracles. He could not. He was without power to. I mean, there's no softening this. He chose not to. It is phrased in the terms of their lack of faith kept him from being able to do any miracles in this hometown. Matthew tells this exact same story and softens it. Matthew says he didn't. He did not do any great miracles in their presence. But Mark is the only one who does this. I've said before that Mark has what's called the lowest Christology. In other words, Mark has the most human Jesus of all of four Gospels. John has the most godlike Jesus. He has the highest Christology. Mark has the lowest Christology. Mark has the Jesus that's hungry and tired and at times grumpy and very, very human in the telling of the story here. So,
what did you say was the other translation for appalled?
Shocked.
Shocked.
Yeah. Surprised. Sometimes. Is that squirrel still trying to get in the door? We've had a squirrel try to come in the door all day today, so we're not welcoming the squirrel in. We love God's creatures, great and small, but the squirrel has outside, we have inside. That's an agreement, and we're not letting the squirrel in the study tonight. So I'll do my St. Francis later and go preach to the squirrel some other time, but out there, not in here. So this is one of those places that I go to in demonstrating, if you want to see a really nice illustration of the Philippians 2 passage that I talk so much about. The Philippians 2 passage where Jesus does not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing and was obedient even to death on a cross. This notion of Jesus' self-emptying, that Jesus was the fullness of God incarnate, but the fullness of God doesn't necessarily mean all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-present. Hebrews tells us we have a high priest who understands us, and I'm not all-knowing, all-present, or all-powerful, so how can Jesus understand me If Jesus were all that, that's unfair. That's an unfair advantage. And so this is one of the passages you point to that you can still be fully God without being all powerful here, that the miracles worked were miracles because Christ lived close to the Spirit and not because Christ had an advantage as God. Yeah, Gail.
So, in order for miracles to happen, isn't like two sides of it? The person that's performing the miracle? and the people that
It
are
would
observing?
seem that's exactly right. Yes, I will. It would seem that's exactly right. That to perform that Jesus is only able to perform the miracle to the degree the person believes the miracle can be done.
And then being from the hometown, I imagine, hey, we knew this guy when he was growing up.
Correct.
So we see him in this light versus the miracle.
That's exactly right. Everybody who grew up with him sees him growing up and knows, the knobby-kneed Jesus with acne, and who didn't go to seminary. He didn't go get trained under a rabbi. He didn't go to Jerusalem and study under Gamaliel. He didn't do any of the things that rabbis do. He worked as a carpenter, perhaps, and so now here he comes back in and teaches. What's this authority? What are all these works we hear that this is done? Nothing happening here because they don't believe. So God is only doing the miracle that you believe God can do. Yeah. So, yes, Bob.
You point out something that always fascinates me, and that's we have examples of what Jesus didn't do for
Right.
a long period of time. We don't know what he did.
We don't. No.
We know that he wasn't trained in the synagogue. 'Cause
Correct.
They said he was not trained in the synagogue.
Yes. Yes.
But we don't know what.
There are huge gaps in the life of Jesus that the Bible has no problem leaving, right? I mean, and this is one of those times that I have a very deeply held theological answer that sounds like a cop-out. But this is a deeply held theological answer, and that is, it's not that important. If the Bible didn't think it was important enough to tell us about it, we probably shouldn't get bent out of shape about it. That this is one of those times I go to the John 20 passage where if we told everything that Jesus did, it would fill all the books in all the world, but these are written that you might believe. That sense in which what we've told you is enough. What we've told you, you've got enough here. You don't need the Jesus' story from 0 to 30 to get into to know who God is. Jesus shows you who God is enough with these stories. Yeah, absolutely. But the funny thing about that, Bob, is that because the Bible doesn't give us those details, I have often said the less the Bible says about something, the more money you can make off of it. And so the gaps, people love to fill in. Oh my gosh. I mean, I mean, this is a human nature thing. Ancient stories that try to fill in the gap. There's an apocryphal text called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas that talks about what it was to grow up as Jesus. And of course, it focuses on a high Christology Jesus. So a Jesus that is having to come to terms with what it is to be so powerful. So like one of the kids in the town square bumped into him. So he cursed the kid and the kid died. And everybody was mad that he cursed this kid. And so he brought him back to life. And Jesus went down by the creek on the Sabbath and made clay pigeons. Like pigeons made out of clay, not like he wasn't skeet shooting. He was pigeons out of clay, and then they were accusing him of working on the Sabbath. So he brought the pigeons to life and they flew away. And so telling these stories of Jesus growing up as this powerful, because the Bible doesn't give us those details, right? So people just imagine these stories that they wrote down, and some of them were very popular in the church, and some of those traditions you can still hear about. But yeah, those are extra biblical narratives in that. You're exactly right. We have a lot we don't have. Now, part of the reason is that 30 was when you were expected to be a grown-up. That 30 was when it was time for public service in the temple, when you were 30. 30 was an age when people started, maybe serving in their civil careers and that kind of thing. It was a time when it's time for you to do what you're going to do, whatever it is you're going to do. And so when Luke says Jesus was about 30 when he began his ministry, the idea is not to give us, 30, interesting. Okay, 30 minus 33, no, the point is, it was time. He was old enough to when you would do this sort of thing. He's not too young. This is about the age you would expect him to start this. So it's really not, it's not giving us a mathematical term, it's giving us a functional kind of definition there. So, but yeah, we do get these are some of the same family, by the way, that you would imagine were calling him a problem just last week, that were saying that we need to get him out in the whole Beelzebub conversation, and he's crazy, we got to get him out, he's embarrassing us. Who are my family? But those that do the will of the one who sent me. Ron?
Real minor question. Is this gospel that references Jesus being a carpenter, or does it, because we know Joseph was a carpenter. Do the other gospels reference?
It's a great question. I think that's correct. I think that when Matthew tells the story, he may have that same line.
Okay.
Matthew doesn't change much about when Mark tells something. He usually uses almost the same language. I don't believe Luke has that line. But yeah. Matthew has more Joseph in it anyway, so I think that might be why that would still be there. Luke is a very Mary gospel. Matthew's a very Joseph gospel. We'll see that when we tell those stories. But yeah.
James, the only brother that kind of signed up.
It's the only one we have tradition on that, yeah. Thank you, I didn't repeat that one. Is James the only brother that signed up? Tradition says this is the James that wrote the book of James. That the James, the disciples, were both martyred young and not able to do that. But this James becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church later, much later, and is the one who writes the book of James. I want to share this with you, but it might ruin your experience like it ruins my experience of things. For some reason, most of the time in Bible translations, they simply transliterate names. In other words, Joseph becomes Joseph, right? Jesus becomes Jesus. For some reason, James is an exception in this, and I can only assume that, I don't know if I want to blame King James or if he's a sign of this. The word in Greek is literally Jacob. It's Jacob. It's the Hebrew name Jacob. And consistently, all throughout the New Testament, anytime Jacob comes in there, you translate that James. So I never understood why we do Joseph as Joseph, but Jacob as James. Why do we have to change that? I think it explains why followers of King James were called Jacobites. That's right, Jacobites, exactly. But I don't know why we don't just say Jacob. What's wrong with saying Jacob? Why we got to Greek that word, but we don't Greek the others? I don't know what it is. We see this sometimes, right? So Yevgeny will sometimes be Eugene, right? And you get some of the other people will just sort of anglicize their names as opposed to, and so some people will do that, but sometimes they hold on to their original pronunciation and we use, and I don't know why we just say Jacob. It's a Hebrew name, it's Jacob, why we got a Greek? This bothers me, it bothers obviously none of you, you're all staring at me, so that's fine. I'll just go to counseling and move through it, but this has always troubled me on this. So, any other questions on this that I can answer? How about that? Yeah, that usually limits the questions that I can answer. So, okay, he was appalled by their disbelief. Couldn't do any miracles. Then Jesus traveled through the surrounding villages teaching. He called for the 12 and sent them out in pairs. He gave them authority over unclean spirits, instructed them to take nothing for their journey except a walking stick, no bread, no bags, no money in their belts. He told them to wear sandals, but not to put on 2 shirts. He said, whatever house you enter, remain there until you leave that place. If the place doesn't welcome you or listen to you, as you leave, shake the dust off your feet as a witness against them. So they went out and proclaimed that people should change their hearts and lives. They cast out many demons. They anointed many sick people with olive oil and healed them. A lot going on here culturally that we could miss. When Jesus says, don't take anything for the journey, no bread, no bags, no money, don't wear 2 shirts. What Jesus is telling them is, these people are going to feel under an obligation of hospitality to take care of you. You can expect that you will meet a friendly audience, that you will meet people that will take care, people that will look after you as you go. Later on in the story, we get a warning that the time will come that they have to take stuff with them because people aren't going to accept. The time will come they're not going to be accepted. But at this point in the story, Jesus is saying, you can count on people taking you. Hospitality was a huge deal in the ancient world. And there was an expectation that your people would take care of you. And in Judaism, everyone was going to be your people. Going to be take care of you. You could expect that. And so he's saying, they'll take you in. Whenever you go there, if they welcome you, go. If they don't welcome you, this is the shake the dust off your feet line. This was a practice when entering the Holy Land. So remember, the Jewish diaspora was pretty broad. People were coming from Rome and from Greece and from Turkey, all over the world. And when they entered the land that God had promised the people, they would shake the Gentile dust off their feet and they would walk on holy ground, right? This land that God has given them. Basically, Jesus is saying, if someone doesn't receive you, you treat them like Gentiles. Treat them like outsiders. Because the people who welcome you, they're the insiders, they're the family. The people who don't welcome you, they're the outsiders. Even though they are related, even though they're part of the Jewish people, even though they are your people, you treat them like they're not your people. You just shake the dust off your feet and walk back onto the Holy Land that way. So this is all basically a statement of hospitality. This is a hospitality passage. That you don't have to take anything because they'll welcome you in. They don't welcome you in, they're not family. And just treat them like they're not family. It's a Gentile house, even though it's a Jewish house. It's not. It's a Gentile house. And so I think that's an important cultural thing to understand what's going on in this passage. Right? This is a huge hospitality picture here. And they cast out many demons, anointed the sick. They had great success in this story. A lot of stuff happening, one right after another. Right? We have this hometown, then he travels, this happens. Pretty soon we get a flashback to John the Baptist's death. There's a reminder that John had died, the feeding of the 5,000. All this happens in quick succession here in chapter 6. It's a big day for Jesus. It comes off as a really big day. His family dies with John dying. The disciples have this great success. The people are hungry when he tries to escape from them. So it's a big day. Ministry is relentless, as we find out. Thoughts or questions, comments? Yes, Bob. Yes, you're making a frowny face, Bob.
Well, I don't know if anybody else is going to see this in this text, but I think Jesus is trying to teach them to use their resources well. Don't use up too much energy in a place where they're not even welcoming you. Because
interesting.
your message, you'll be wasting too much energy and they don't want to hear it anyway.
Yeah. I think that's part of it.
I know it doesn't say that, but I'm reading that into that somehow.
I think that could be part of it. Don't waste your time in a place that's not receiving you. I think that's part of it. I also think it is also don't curse them. Don't reject them. Treat them as though they're outsiders. But that is not, obviously that's not a commendation to them, but it is also not cursing them. It is treating them as though they don't understand. That's how you should treat them. That it doesn't even apply to them. Just move on. This message doesn't apply to them. They're completely outside the understanding of this. Move on. Yeah, move on. It's not a curse. I think it's almost a pity in a way. It's like, well, you didn't get it. Okay, and you move on. Yeah, Anna.
I have some question about sending people out in pairs.
Mm-hmm.
Could you share some insight?
Sending people out in pairs. I hadn't thought about that. I don't know. It's commonly what is done is that people are commissioned in pairs as they go. I'm sure there's something to it. It is still done. Yeah, it is still done. I know that I wonder how much this might happen. Often in Roman combat, people would fight back to back. That you don't have your back isn't armored very time, so you usually face the enemy, or you are back to back if they're surrounded. So I wonder how much that might figure into it. I don't know. I'm just spitballing with some random ideas on that because I don't know about the pairs. That's a good question. I can take longer to say I don't know than anybody, and that's. Who drew Judas? That's a good question. But again, at this point in the story, nobody's, John lets you know all the time nobody wants Judas. When you're reading the Gospel of John, it's like, and then Judas, he's the one who used to steal money from the thing. Don't know Judas. But in the synoptics, it's like, Matthew, Mark, Judas, all these, he's just listed them. Mark was not a disciple, but he's listing all of the disciples, and Judas is just thrown in there like, and Judas. John will let you know you don't want to be with Judas, but nobody else seems to have that attitude, which is interesting.
One other question.
Sure.
In the context of this, it almost seems like he left Nazareth or
Mm-hmm.
wherever, and immediately does this,
Mm-hmm.
which is right at the start of the ministry.
Yeah. Yes, from the Mark telling here, yeah.
Yeah, from the Mark telling.
Yeah.
So how do these guys know anything?
Even know what they're doing, yeah. I think he walked them through basic exorcism and healing, 101. He asked how the disciples even know at this point in the ministry, and I don't know. You're right. It's pretty quick. in the story. Although they've done a little stuff up to now. We're approaching halfway in the story, so they should have picked up something. Like I said, they did okay. Anointed sick people and cast out some demons, so they have some failures on that pretty soon they get a little frustrated about, but at least at this point, doing okay. It's funny, Mark has several stories of partial healing where like the blind man gets mud on his eyes and Jesus says, what do you see? Well, I see some trees walking around. It's like, well, go finish washing. And then he finishes like, oh, he can see. The sense of partial healing as he goes through. And I wonder if that same illustration of partial understanding goes through, because we get that a lot, right? With Peter, we'll see a little bit later. You're the Christ, but not the Christ, the Son of God, just the Christ. He kind of gets it, but not quite. Like people almost get it. They're healing. They're doing really well. And then pretty soon we're going to see they aren't able to do as well as they'd like in that story. Yeah. So the apostles returned to Jesus and told him everything they'd done and taught. So in between, this is the story of John the Baptist killing. We preached on that a little bit ago where Herod beheads John the Baptist. The apostles returned to Jesus, told him everything they'd done and taught. Many people were coming and going, so there was no time to eat. He said to the apostles, come by yourselves to a secluded place and rest for a while. And they departed in a boat by themselves for a deserted place. But you try and get away, and they just follow you, boy. Many people saw them leaving, recognized them, and ran ahead from all the cities and arrived before them. So apparently they're sailing across, and the crowd is running around the perimeter of the lake to meet them where they're going to be when they get to the other side, which is interesting. When Jesus arrived, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them. Splagnidzithe. It's a great word in Greek. Had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. Now remember, he started out to get away from the crowd, right? We're just going to need a minute. Let's go to a secluded place. And when he got to the other side and they had beat him to the other side and saw him, he saw them as like, okay, let's just go ahead and teach. And he had compassion on them. He saw them, their commitment, their whatever it was moved him. And instead of withdrawing and hiding, he goes ahead and engages with people, which I find that fascinating. Late in the day, his disciples came to him and said, this is an isolated place. It is already late in the day. Send them away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy something to eat for themselves. Jesus replies, you should give them something to eat. But they said to him, should we go off and buy bread worth 8 months' pay to give it to them to eat? Remember I told you the disciples and Jesus, little more friction in Mark than many of the Gospels. Right? You should feed them. Oh, we're going to go buy 8 months' worth of food for these people? That's what we're going to do? Okay. The sarcasm. It is absolutely sarcasm in the Bible right here. Yeah, should we go do that? And he said, how much bread do you have? Take a look. And after checking, they said 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That's all we can come up with in all of this. So he directed the disciples to seat all the people in the groups as though they were having a banquet on the green grass. Well, he tells us the grass is green. We probably knew that. We would, but actually this is important. Because again, like I said, he's telling us that this is the rainy season. He's telling us this is not between May and September. This is happening between October and April, because October and April are the only times it rains in Israel. That 6 months is the only rainy season you get in Israel. So you get some pretty impressive storms. It's why the Canaanites had a storm god that was dying and being reborn every year. The storm god in Canaanite religion would die every April and come back from the dead every October because that's when the rains went and came away. It was very cyclical. So they sit on the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. I don't know if that's 150s or hundreds and 50s, but I don't know. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looked up to heaven, blessed them, broke the loaves into pieces, and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Everyone ate until they were full. They filled 12 baskets with the leftover pieces of bread and fish. About 5,000 had eaten. So we have the feeding of the 5,000 with 12 basketfuls left over. So Jesus is able to provide enough for, 12. That's a pretty significant number, 12 basketfuls. So enough for the nation of Israel is basically the image that you have here. Anytime you see 12, you think tribes, you think Israel. That's always that's why there's 12 disciples, right? 12 tribes, 12 basketfuls left over. That's going to be important because there's another feeding pretty soon, and it's a little bit different in the way it's told. So that's worth noting here. So no story of the boy. That's in John. So in Mark, it's just, what you got? I don't know. We got 5 loaves and 2 fish.
John is the only one that includes the boy,
Mm-hmm.
which I love because.
Andrew was bringing the boy. We don't know if the boy was volunteering his lunch in John. We just
there was
Andrew
a
says,
boy.
"Here's this kid with a lunch." So it's my lunch. Why don't you all bring something?
I just love that version because
It
it
is.
reminds me we are invited to be,
Yep.
do great works.
And the cool thing
God.
about Andrew in that story is Andrew's always, all throughout John, Andrew's always bringing people to Jesus. Andrew brings Simon. Andrew brings the boy. Andrew's always bringing people to, hey, here's 5 loaves and 2 fishes, but what is this among so many? This is just, what do you have? I got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Okay, that's plenty. Everybody sit down. So miraculous feeding in the wilderness, some Moses foreshadowing in many ways. Matthew makes it very explicit. Matthew loves to talk about Jesus as the new Moses. So this feeding in the wilderness thing is much bigger in Matthew. I mean, he tells it in a way that invokes Moses more directly than Mark does. Mark's doing it, but he does it more directly there.
Just a quick observation.
Sure.
At the beginning, he's not recognized in this area.
Mm-mm.
He's not honored.
That's right.
It's quite the opposite.
Well, he goes, this is a new area. Remember, he hopped on the boat.
Well, that's what I was getting ready. Was it really that far away?
Well,
Where
I
he
mean,
sends the 12 out? And
well-
all the quick point I was wanting to make, see if I'm
Please.
right, is that all of a sudden, just the throwing out of the demons has him
oh,
having hundreds of people chasing him out.
so you
Trying to
see,
catch him up.
you see the disciples' mission as bringing attention to Jesus
Yeah.
to the degree that the people then follow Jesus after they see what the disciples can do.
It just seems that way.
That, you know what, I hadn't put that story together before. I'd never thought about that. I normally think of them just thinking of Jesus, but yeah, you're exactly right. That the way the story is told,
And
yeah.
the story says he authorized them to throw out the
Yeah.
demons,
Mm-hmm.
evil
Yeah.
spirits or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Demons, evil spirits, absolutely. Yeah, good point. I hadn't seen that. Well done. So then, right then, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake toward Bethsaida. While he dismissed the crowd, after saying goodbye to them, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray. So he finally gets his moment. Evening came, and the boat was in the middle of the lake, but he was alone on the land. He saw his disciples struggling. They were trying to row forward, but the wind was blowing against them. Very early in the morning, he came to them walking on the lake. He intended to pass by them, which I still love. They're struggling, and he's like, well, sucks to be y'all. You should walk. Wouldn't be a problem. When they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost and screamed. This is where the day gets even worse, right? I mean, you're already struggling with the storm, and now some ghost is running across at you. Seeing him was terrifying to all of them. Just then he spoke, "Be encouraged, it's me, don't be afraid." The translation is fine. It makes sense in English. Literally what he says is, "Be encouraged, don't be afraid, I am." It is the phrase "I am" in Greek. So it's me, okay, but you can't say "I am" without immediately thinking of Yahweh. And so it is another one of what I like to call those functional claims of deity. Moving across the chaos waters and saying, "I am." I mean, he's God, is what the point of this story is. This is not just this is God alone. Got into the boat, the wind settled down, so chaos is calmed after he's walked across it. Who does that kind of thing? His disciples were so baffled they were beside themselves. That's because they hadn't understood about the loaves. Their minds had been closed, so they resisted God's ways. I love a couple of times in Mark, the author, says the connections are clear and obvious, and I have no idea what he's talking about. See, they were confused about him walking on the water because they hadn't understood about the whole bread thing. Apparently I hadn't either because I'm missing that connection completely. Why is understanding the bread thing explain this? I'm not real sure. I mean, unless he just means, look, he provided, so he's God feeding you in the wilderness, so he's God, and that's why. Okay, I mean, I get that. That's probably true, but it doesn't seem that obvious to me that we should come down on him so hard for, they didn't get it because they didn't understand the bread thing. That's why they were confused. Okay. I am also confused, if I could. But there's another one later on to me that's even funnier, because Jesus makes an explanation and the disciples are like, what? And I am too. So, functional claim for deity here. Jesus is God. Forgives sins all the way through. This is the passage. The Pharisees and some legal experts from Jerusalem, so here our legal experts are back, Howie. Our legal experts from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus. They saw some of his disciples eating food with unclean hands. They were eating without first ritually purifying with their hands through washing. The Pharisees and all the Jews don't eat without first washing their hands carefully. This is a way of observing the rules handed down by the elders. Upon returning from the marketplace, they don't eat without first immersing themselves. They observe many other rules that have been handed down, such as the washing of cups and jugs and pans and sleeping mats. Now, there's no parentheses in Greek, but every translator assumes this is explaining this tradition so you can understand this story. So that's one of the reasons that the belief is Mark is written to an audience unfamiliar with Judaism, or so the way it's practiced in Jerusalem, at least. So the Pharisees and legal experts asked Jesus, why are your disciples not living according to the rules handed down by the elders, but instead eat food with ritually unclean hands? Which seems like a reasonable question, I think. If you are a Pharisee or a legal expert and you are practicing in this way and Jesus seems to agree with you on everything else, why is Jesus not agreeing with you on this? Pretty fair. Anything there before I keep going? These ritual washing is, the ritual immersion is common in the area right at the northern edge of the Dead Sea where the Essenes were, where John the Baptist was. Essenes were even more fastidious about ritual cleansing, and so the area at Qumran, where everyone assumes these practicers were, it's a desert area, but it has over this 40 or 50 acre site a number of plaster baths to capture the half inch of rain that comes every year and funnel it into these. So you can, that's a lot of water, half an inch over 40 acres, 50 acres. If you can capture as much of that as possible, huge cisterns, and funnel it into these ritual baths. You would do it before eating at meals, you would do it before praying, you would do it before. So this ritual washing was very common around these people. So it's interesting to me that something so common would need to be explained, which is why I think this is written outside of Israel, because this would have been such a common experience in Israel that why the parentheses? But
Rob, what do they actually do? I don't know what ritual washing is. I know what washing is.
You know what washing is. Good. That's relaxing. The bath itself is simply an immersive one. Usually you pray before, you immerse, you pray after. It has to be done in living water, but the rabbis decreed that, so no ponds. You can't do it in a pond or a lake even. But it has to be water that flows. And so all of these mikvahs are designed, a mikvah is the ritual bath. All these mikvahs are designed so that there's this huge 4 foot by 6 foot area that goes about 3 or 4 feet deep. And at the top of it, at the water line, there's this channel that goes into an area beside it that's maybe 1 foot by 2 feet, so that the water sloshes in and sloshes back, and the rabbi says that's living water. As long as the water can flow in that and come back, that counts as a stream, and it counts. And so they would do this. Now, if they could do it in the Jordan, that would work. But most of the time it was done in these ritual baths. They step down, and what often happens is there's lines that are in the steps, and you would go down one side unclean, immerse yourself, and come up the other side, the clean side, because you don't want to unclean yourself on the dirty steps that you came down on. So very formalized procession as you go through it.
So naked?
No, clothed, usually. Yeah.
So then you come out with wet clothes.
You come out with wet clothes, but at Qumran, you'll have wet clothes for about 15 minutes. So, yeah. It is an arid area. Yeah. So why are your disciples not living according to the rules? This seems to be a pretty easy question, right? Just going to answer the question why they don't want to do this. How does Jesus respond? He replied, Isaiah really knew what he was talking about when he prophesied about you hypocrites. It's like, wow, that's a little harsh, isn't it? I mean, seemed to be a reasonable question. He wrote, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is empty, since they teach instructions that are human words. You ignore God's commandment while holding on to rules created by humans and handed down to you. Jesus continued. He was on a roll. You don't want to interrupt Jesus when he's going. Clearly, you are experts at rejecting God's commandment in order to establish these rules. Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and the person who speaks against father or mother will certainly be put to death. But you say, if you tell your father or mother everything I'm expected to contribute to you is Corban, that is a gift I'm receiving from God, then you're no longer required to care for your father or mother. In this way, you do away with God's word in favor of the rules handed down to you, which you pass on to others, and you do a lot of other things just like that. That's just the first one I thought of, but I could go on, but I'm not gonna, because I just already showed you the one, and that's plenty. So it's like, wow, that seems a harsh answer to that. So obviously something has been brewing that we're missing, I think, in this conversation. Something was asked in this question in a way that Jesus heard that I didn't hear. Something was going on there. But he goes on to say, he calls the crowd and says, listen to me, all of you, and understand nothing outside a person can enter and contaminate a person in God's sight. Rather, things that come out of a person contaminate the person. So there you go.
It's a pretty big change for them.
It is a huge change to say that. Yes, that's right. That is right.
Hot button.
What's that?
That was a hot button.
That was obviously a hot button for Jesus. Yes. There was something about that question. But I mean, Jesus took it as an opportunity to distinguish what was being done with the law versus what he's trying to do with the law. Whereas what was being done with the law was to, again, to get around it, if you will, to do everything you could to avoid it, if you will. And he's saying you're obeying the letter and not the spirit. You know, there's nothing wrong with what you're doing, but you're doing it so that you don't have to do other things and actually do what God said.
Human rules.
He does call it human rules. Yeah, it's pretty insulting. It is a pretty blasphemous statement. Yeah, it is. That is a fairly anti-Jewish statement in this point. Yeah, very much so, because those human rules were said to be from the mouth of God and recorded as from the mouth of God in the Mishnah even. So, yeah, that's pretty harsh. Pretty harsh. You okay, Bob?
Well, they were acting as hypocrites.
They were, apparently.
We know that. When Jesus told the parable, he pointed out, you got these people that are trying to stay clean, so they're going around the injured man.
Right.
Oh, I got things.
But that was Luke. This is Mark. We haven't seen that in Mark yet.
No, but I'm saying that was going on.
There were people who were, yes, and actually those people were condemned by that later Jewish law. The Talmud later condemns the way in which certain legal experts and other Jewish leaders were using excuses to not do what God wanted. I mean, that is condemned in Jewish writings as well as in the New Testament, of the way that they are acting. It's not held up as honored in any way.
So the writer wanted to give us all the extra background about the rituals,
Yeah,
without mentioning that they really went
right.
too far and tried to enforce those things
As opposed to other things.
and
Right.
instead of being caring and compassionate.
Correct. That's true. That's true.
So it's just the way the story's told does seem like Jesus' response
like,
is
wow.
completely inappropriate.
He just really flew off the handle here. But yes, there's more going on as always. Yes.
So just a quick note.
Please.
I asked Mr. Google why Jesus sent them out in pairs.
Oh, yes?
And Mr. Google said that was because under the old covenant, everyone had to work individually. And under the new covenant,
I would say Mr. Google is wrong.
that this would show that they could do the impossible. And there was something magic about you had to have two.
Now, I will say having a witness is something you could
You had to
argue.
have two witnesses
Yeah.
to convict someone.
True.
And the idea that they were together showed that they were mutually working towards one common goal that they both believed in.
Okay, I would argue it might be just simple as you have a witness to the events that are happening. Yeah. That's as far as I'm going to go with Google on that one. Yeah, I wouldn't go as far as the other stuff. Yeah. So after this, Jesus goes into more Gentile areas up in the north. In those days, another large crowd with nothing to eat. This is while he is in what is basically southern Lebanon, if you will. So it's very far in the north. In those days, there was another large crowd with nothing to eat. Jesus called his disciples and told them, I feel sorry for the crowd because they have been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they won't have enough strength to travel, for some have come a long distance. His disciples responded, how can anyone get enough food in this wilderness to satisfy these people? Jesus said, how much bread do you have? Second time he's asked this question. They said, well, 7 loaves. We knew this time we got an extra 2. just in case. He told the crowd to sit on the ground. He took 7 loaves, gave thanks, broke them apart, gave them to the disciples to distribute, and gave the bread to the crowd. They also had a few fish. Oh, well, you mentioned the fish among our assets to begin with. Interesting. He said a blessing over them, then gave them to the disciples to hand out also. They ate until they were full and collected 7 basketful of leftovers. This was a crowd of about 4,000 people. Jesus sent them away, then got into a boat with his disciples and went over to the region of Dalmanutha. This is not a great way to tell the story because you should always build up to more excitement, right? He should feed 4,000 first and then show he can do 5,000 on top of that. Going with 5,000 and going to 4,000 seems a little anticlimactic to me. Doesn't it seem to you? It just seems like you didn't stage it the right way. But, important point in the order telling. How many basketfuls were left over after the feeding of the 5,000? 12. How many are left over the feeding of the 4,000? 7. Why? Okay, what was your question?
Why is it now 7?
Why didn't he make as much this time as he did last time when he had 2 extra pieces of bread? It's a good question. What is the symbol of 7?
Creation.
There you go. It's creation. It's the whole world. This is in a Gentile area, and it is now, if 12 basketfuls was telling us Jesus has enough for the entire nation of Israel, 7 basketfuls is telling us Jesus has enough for the whole world. Yeah. That's the specialness of 7, is the completeness and wholeness and fullness and absolute. For all of creation, he has enough now. Yeah. So both Jews and Gentiles in this message by telling this feeding, 5,000 and 4,000. So it's not about the numbers, because like I said, that's anticlimactic. It's about the significance of those numbers, Israel and the world. Yeah. Good. The Pharisees showed up again. I don't know why they come back, and they began to argue with Jesus. To test him, they asked for a sign from heaven. With an impatient sigh, Jesus said, "Why does this generation look for a sign? I assure you no sign will be given to it." And leaving them, he got back in the boat and crossed to the other side of the lake. And why are they asking for a sign? He's been doing nothing but signs for 8 chapters now. We've had miracles, we've had miraculous feedings, and but what are you going to do for us? What sign you got for me? Jesus' disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, so they only had 1 loaf with them in the boat. He gave them strict orders: watch out and be on your guard for the yeast of the Pharisees as well as the yeast of Herod, or the yeast of the Herodians, which I think probably is referring to the Essenes, but I'm very minor in that. So we'll talk about that in a second. The disciples discussed things among themselves and said, "He said this because we have no bread." So beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of the Herodians. He's just complaining because we only brought the 1 loaf. That's what he's on about now. Completely missing the point, right? Jesus is talking about the damage that comes from the teachings of these people that lead people astray, and they're like, "We should have brought more bread," and he wouldn't be mad. That's the problem. And so Jesus knows this. Jesus knew what they were discussing and said, "Why are you talking about the fact you don't have any bread? Don't you grasp what has happened? Don't you understand? Are your hearts so resistant to what God is doing? Don't you have eyes? Why can't you see? Don't you have ears? Why can't you hear? Don't you remember when I broke 5 loaves of bread for those 5,000 people? How many basketfuls were left over?" They said 12. So they were paying attention. "When I broke 7 loaves of bread for the 4,000 people, how many basketfuls were left over, did you gather?" They said 7. And then for some reason, it cut off the next verse. Bob, do you have 8:21?
8:21 in mine says, he says, "Do you still not get it?"
Do you still not get it? That's perfectly good. Do you still not understand? Are you really so dull? Literally in some translations. I told you, a lot of friction in Mark between Jesus and the disciples on this that we sometimes miss, right? This is frustration. We're in chapter 8. And I've done this already. And you think I'm talking about the loaf of bread you brought?
Jesus is really showing his human side here.
Very low Christology, yes. Very human Jesus in Mark. Very human Jesus. Matt, Nancy?
What's yeast of Herod and
The yeast of Herod and the yeast of the Pharisees. Yeast is going to have, obviously significant meaning to a people that came out of Egypt with unleavened bread, right? Yeast, there's nothing wrong with yeast in Jewish eating. That's fine, except during Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You can't have it then. So there is an association of yeast with that, obviously. So while it's not necessarily evil, if you will, it calls to mind that, I think, just to bring it in. And the whole idea of this little bit of yeast that ferments the whole loaf. I think the dangerous teachings that get in there and grow is the idea. Yeah, you just listen to them and here they come. The reason, there were, as I mentioned when we talked about the Jewish sectarian groups, there were three major Jewish sectarian groups of similar numbers, or at least large numbers: Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Pharisees and Sadducees are mentioned in the Bible. We've seen that. Essenes are not, which is unusual because Josephus says they numbered as many as the Pharisees. Now, they were pretty reclusive, and so that could be an issue, but don't know for sure if they're ever mentioned. However, for some reason, I will say this, there is reason to believe that Herod the Great had favorable attitude toward the Essenes. They were in a very close area to several of his palaces, both at Jericho and down south in Masada. It was an article by Yigael Yadin, who is actually an archaeologist, an Israeli archaeologist, who basically equated the Herodians, or what was translated Herod here, with the Essenes, because because Herod had such a favorable attitude toward them, they might even be known as Herodians. No one, to my satisfaction, has ever been able to define who the Herodians were beyond that swing, because we don't really talk about them anywhere else. It's not like they seem to have their own belief. Are they just, is it Herod? Is that who he means? Does he mean followers of Herod, people like Herod, people, his soldiers? I mean, what does he mean? I am convinced, relatively, I'm 80%, that the Essenes are the Herodians here, and it's the same kinds of teachings, right? The ritual washings, the ritual cleanings. He would have the same complaint of the Essenes he would have with the Pharisees, with their emphasis on law, even more strict for the Essenes. So that's what I think is happening here, and why he mentions the yeast of the Essenes and the yeast of the Pharisees. Yeah. Don't you get it? Why can't you see? Why can't you hear? I've been talking for 8 chapters. Nothing. God, people are so dull. That's Jesus in Mark, which not a Jesus we see often talked about. The John Jesus is much more popular, gliding in, dispassionate, always in control, never having anything to say. In Mark, Jesus gives the bread to the disciples. Hand this out. Right? In John, Jesus hands out the bread to the 5,000. Right? Jesus always in control in John. Nobody doing anything for Jesus in John. Mark, everybody's mad at everybody. It's just, disciples are mad at Jesus. Jesus is mad at the disciples. Great story. It's just so good. Love the Gospel of Mark. If it wasn't for the Greek, I would love the Gospel of Mark. So, well, we're going to stop there. We haven't yet to, for 3 weeks I've thought we might get to the confession of Jesus, but we haven't yet. Confession that Jesus is the Christ. We'll get there. We'll get there next week for sure. But please.
So this just ended. I mean,
it did.
I get it, that ended.
Do you not get it is the last verse of that pericope. Yes,
so
that's it. I think it's a rhetorical question from Jesus' perspective. The answer is no, they do not get it. Yes. That is the end of the story.
So much is talked about with bread there. First, am I interrupting you, Bob?
Nope.
So much is talked about with bread, and it's the bread they don't have that they're complaining about that he reacts to.
Yes.
Is bread symbolic now?
Oh, that's a great question. The bread they don't have that they're thinking he's complaining about. Wow. I think I could make something out of that if I wanted to, Ron. That was good.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Bread.
Right.
But when he fires off at them, he's talking about it because they've said we don't have any bread.
And his point is, no, you don't.
They're focused on the wrong thing.
Right.
Obviously.
Yeah. Yeah, that is an excellent observation. Yes, well done. Yeah, I like that. See, this is why I like teaching, because you guys get better ideas than me when we teach these things. That's great. Yeah, very good. Well, go ahead, Nancy.
They still are not coming to some recognition that he is the bread.
Correct.
I mean,
Right.
just think about what Ron is saying.
Right. I mean, we certainly see that later on, right? This is my
Yeah.
body. I mean, that is in Mark. We have the Lord's Supper there. And so, yeah, I think that's what I'm saying, that how insightful that is, that they're complaining about the bread they don't have, and interestingly enough, so is Jesus. They're not talking about the same bread. Yeah. Really well done there. Good. Well, hopefully we have equally insightful things next week. So next week is the 30th, yeah? So we will have Bible study again next week, right here, and continue in our journey in Mark. So Thank you. You can